Thank you. I'm just amazed at the size of this crowd tonight, and I very much appreciate your all coming out. As I say to people, if my voice should drop, I've never been married, and I don't have children, so I've never really learned how to yell. All right. So if my voice should drop, if someone in the back would just wave your hand, I won't call on you, but I'll know what you're wanting me to do, which is to raise my voice. I've always had a penchant for controversial topics. I just love them. And the crisis in the church is made for someone like me, who loves controversy. I am actually kind of obsessed with what's going on in the church today. I hope not too many of you are. It's not necessarily good for your psychology, for depression, for all sorts of things. But I think God has called me to do this. I think actually, one day I was walking around where I live and thinking like, what am I doing? Why am I just turning away from doing all the moral theology that I was doing, etc., and turning over to working with sex abuse victims and trying to figure out what happened to the church that I love so much. And I almost heard God say, well, I saw you slowing down, and I thought I needed to give you something to get you revved up again. So I would say that has happened. Not everybody needs to know everything about what's going on in the church, and not everybody needs to do a deep dive. But I do think it's a good idea to be generally aware of what's happening. And if it begins to threaten your faith, if anything I say today begins to threaten your faith, I want you to ask God to delete it from your brain. All right, I think we should never give up our faith. I love my Jesus and I love my church, and I'm extremely demoralized by what has been happening in the church. But I still believe that the Holy Spirit's in charge, and I can't wait to see what the Holy Spirit does to clean it up. All right? It's going to happen. I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime, but it will happen. And I hope I'll be seeing it from another perch, maybe where I'll be calmer than I am now. All right, so the crisis in the church, I'm going to cover quite a bit of material let me see where I want to do something here. Okay, quite a bit of material under different questions. One is question, where are we today in the church? Why do I say there's a crisis in the church? I would love to have a little questionnaire and have everybody put down why they think we're in a crisis today, because there's a lot of reasons. How did we get here? I suspect that's the most important question that I'm going to be answering today, is giving some explanations of how we got where we are today. And what do we do about it? Right? I've been analyzing. Of course, people ask afterwards, like, well, what can we do? I hope I give you some somewhat satisfactory answers. This is, in a sense, where it began for me. This is McCarrick with James Grine. As you remember, Carrick is the cardinal who was abusing seminarians at a beach house in New Jersey for years, calling up the seminary and asking them to send him 5 young men for a weekend at the seminary, having beds for only 4 of them, and the 5th would have to share the bed with McCarrick. It's an astonishing thing, and that picture actually makes me sick. It makes me sick to my stomach. McCarrick has been charged with criminal behavior, but he is now 93 years old or so, and has been he says he has dementia and he can't stand trial. But he has ruined people's lives, absolutely ruined them. And this was all in 2018, and I had spent my adult life defending the church, right? Defending the church's teachings, even things like the left-wing politics of the USCCB. I would say, well, they must have a good reason that I just don't know, because really. But I would say, okay, they're just, they're led by the Holy Spirit. They must have a good reason. But this knocked my socks off. Because I had been aware in the 70s and 80s and 90s that there was a lot of sexual corruption in some portions of the church, right? In some portions. And I'd read The Wanderer, and I'd read these things. And before long, I had to cancel my subscription because it was just all too salacious. I was sure that if I knew about it, the bishops knew about it, and they were doing something about it. And it didn't require my knowledge in order to make anything different. And then along came the pedophilia crisis in the early 2000s. And again, I thought, this has just got to be a small portion. Just a small portion of priests who are engaging in pedophilia. And I thought, and again, if I know about it, obviously the bishops had a big synod in Dallas about it. They're doing something about it. I'm sure all over the United States they're meeting and saying, we're doing something about this. And then along came McCarrick, and I realized, no, they're doing nothing except covering up, right? And I started doing kind of a deep dive into what the heck is going on. And the people that I was dealing with had been working on it for much longer than I had, some of them 3 decades of work. And they would just tell me, you can't believe how bad it is. He said, you just can't believe how, you will be shocked. And well, maybe. Though it has true, I tell people all the time, I don't have, honestly, naturally, a cynical bone in my body. I'm a very naive person. I trust people. I grew up in a household where we trusted anybody in authority. We loved the church. We loved our priests. We never suspected anything. Though it turns out that the priest that was the pastor at my parish when I was young was a predator. Right? We had no idea. We had no suspicion at all. And but I've been trying to become more cynical. It's a strange thing to say, but it gets a little closer to reality. It's not natural to me, but I have to make myself do it. And so I keep looking into this and trying to figure out, how did we get here? And I'm going to make a case through this. A very large part of it has been a problem with the seminaries in the United States. I taught at a pretty good seminary for nearly 20 years. But it was one of the worst seminaries in the United States for about 30 years, right? And maybe even 40 years, and produced an enormous number of bishops, a lot of them bad. And I hate to tell you this, but it's not getting any better, all right? As far as seminaries, yes, many of the seminaries are getting better. And some of you will notice in some dioceses, there's better and better priests. These young men go in and they're already formed in a sense, and it's a little bit hard to deform them. But the problem is the bishops appoint bishops, and they are going to appoint their clones of themselves, right? And so until that problem, I don't know that we want to make it that somebody else appoints the bishops, but we've got to get better bishops appointing bishops. One of my hopes is that the bad bishops who are looking for the next round of bishops, honestly, that next round of men who are eligible to be bishops are just about as bad as the bishops, or maybe worse. And that's the ones the bishops on top want. But a lot of them are saying no, right? They're saying no because people are after them. People are onto them. They don't want to be shutting schools and churches and the media coming after them. And then I think there's a third level. I'm trying to talk to the Holy Spirit here. I would advise you, Holy Spirit, think about this as a plan. That there's another layer of bishops. I mean, not bishops, good priests who have been given positions of authority in the church here, there, or elsewhere. And since the second level down from the current bishops are not accepting the invitation to be bishops, I think it's most of the time it's going to be good men who accept the invitation, or a lot of times it's going to be good men because they're not ambitious. They don't want to be bishops for anything, especially now, right? But they'll do it because God wants them to, right? And I hope that they'll figure out how to deal with the problems that we have in front of us. But I'll just do a short run through for some of the things that have been, again, kind of shocking and very shocking in our time. One was Pachamama in Rome, that little statue there, which is a pagan fertility statue that was brought right into St. Peter's, right, a couple of years ago. And you're saying it's really desecration of a sacred place. The John Paul II Institute, there were 9 of them around the world. The foremost one is in Rome. And it has basically been radically changed, where the thought of John Paul II is no longer taught in the John Paul II Institute. But what is taught is basically sociology, science, the modern world. They had an incredible staff of faculty, and most all of them have been dispersed. It kind of helps out seminaries elsewhere who hire them. But the John Paul II Institute was attracting students from around the world and spreading his thought around the world. And the thought of John Paul II is simply no longer welcome in Rome. In a sense, he's being erased. I love John Paul II. I think he's way up there with, I don't know if he's up there with Aquinas, but he's up there. He bequeathed us a intellectual patrimony that's unbelievable. I mean, we would expect seminarians to be spending the next hundreds of years unpacking what John Paul II gave us, which is largely updating the Catholic Church, speaking to modern philosophy back and forth, and maintaining the faith completely. All right, yeah, it is moments, but they're just moments. All right, his patrimony is incredible. I think I missed a slide back here. How can that be? It doesn't want to go backwards. Well, all right, it doesn't want to go backwards. Maybe it comes up later. Because I wanted to talk about different kinds of corruption. I wanted to talk about doctrinal corruption, a crisis in the church, doctrinal, financial, all right, political, moral. All right, I'll see if there's something else that comes up. I had a slide that listed those, and I don't know where it went. Maybe it'll come up later. Anyway, some of you have followed the lawsuit in London that the Vatican had purchased a building in London for an enormous amount of money, and it seems that nobody could figure out what the building is for, what the money was for. It seems to have been a huge money laundering scheme. And the cardinal Cardinal Archbishop Béchu has been convicted of wrongdoing in the Vatican, but he claims he's innocent. And so I have friends who are tracking the money laundering that goes on in the church, and I'll talk more about that later. But it's unbelievable. It's quite unbelievable where the money disappears. And I'll explain in a sense why. And of course, some of you, I suspect, are devotees of the traditional Latin Mass, and I have become one. I spent until I was 16, I went to the traditional Latin Mass, and I liked it, but I have to admit it's nothing like we have today. Our parish priest said it in 19 minutes, so you can imagine how awe-inspiring it was. I mean, he didn't know Latin, he didn't like Latin, and he just raced right through it. The Latin Mass I go to now is at least an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours. There's 18 altar boys routinely, absolutely well-disciplined like you can't imagine. I've become that little old lady that sits there and says, oh, they're so cute. And I can't stand it, honestly. And they're so disciplined and reverent, and sometimes more so than the priest. They never do that elbowing. They never giggle. They're so concentrated, and the whole ceremony is just so profoundly fantastic to me. And so, when the Novus Ordo came, I was pretty much horrified by it. It never satisfied me, but I trusted the church. There must be good reasons for this. And of course, the Latin Mass was not available. I had a few friends who knew where you could find it in some church gymnasium or, some school room, or a priest would be smuggled in to say it. But partly was because I was working so hard defending the church's teaching on contraception that I thought I don't need one more extremely uncontroversial part of my resume to knock me out of having a voice in this world. So anyway, Traditionis Custodes, as you know, is trying to shut down the traditional Latin Mass. And it's, to my mind, it's heartbreaking in the extreme. Well, for good reasons. I'm one of the older ones in any event I come to. But I'm just astonished at how young the people are at the traditional Latin Mass. I would guess fewer than 5% of Catholics, maybe 2% of Catholics, have ever been to a traditional Latin Mass. So where do these hundreds of young people with their children, how do they find it? And they tell me, one after another tells me, well, I dragged the family there and I thought, this would be the last one we'd see. And the kids love it. The kids want to come, right? The Mass they were going to was an hour. This one's at least an hour and a half. And they come early because they have a son who's an altar boy. So they have to come 20 minutes, half an hour early. And then they have to leave 20 minutes to a half an hour late because they clean up. I'm saying, where does this come from? And it's so edifying and inspiring for me. So the beauty of the Latin Mass, again, has been, and the architecture that is suited for it. That is such a big thing. I haven't had a chance to see this gorgeous church, but from outside I could tell it must be spectacular. And if you look at the architecture that was a part of the Latin Mass and the architecture that's a part of the New Mass, it reveals a great deal. Now, I've never been to a clown Mass, thank you God. But most of us have been to a Novus Ordo Mass that we have found highly offensive for one reason or another. That is changing. I think Novus Ordo Masses are becoming more and more reverent. I'm delighted at that, of course. More putting in there's one nearby to me where they put in a whole new back altar and communion rails, and I can't believe the number of people who are kneeling to go to communion. I can't believe I kneel because it's not easy for me to get up, and I've been trying to convince them they ought to put, pray-dos there, that we can, kneelers there, so some of us old folks can get up and down. But one of these days I hope to fall flat on my face, and then everybody will feel bad about it, and they'll put out kneelers. That's what maybe I'll just do that. All right. Okay. So I'm questioning is I'm looking at what I'm looking at is what is happening. What am I looking at, and how did we get here? And then here we have Archie Bunker saying, "I don't see no miracle in how we got here. Here was where we were headed." Okay. All right, here's the slide I was looking for a long time ago. Different kinds of corruptions: doctrinal, financial, political, liturgical, and moral. And various topics. I'm going to take up modernism, modern philosophy, some extent to the Masons, communists, the Vatican Bank, China, Vatican II, the liturgy, and sex abuse. Just to fly by most of them. Doctrinal confusion. A lot of this goes back to modern philosophy, to the Enlightenment, that completely rejected revelation as a source of wisdom. The only wisdom there is in this world that is that which is discovered in a scientific laboratory, or mathematically, or physics. But that you could have a story about Moses or Abraham and Isaac that's a source for truth. People just think it's myths, it's just stories. You really can't build a life or a worldview on the basis of that. Again, rationalism is exactly that. Everything has to be proved by science or by logic. You can't have stories, you can't have literature, you can't have miracles. Miracles are obviously just crazy fantasies that people have. Again, you simply do reject, and then at a certain point, first it's all reason, and then someone like Nietzsche comes along and he says, reason's not going to get you anything. Your reason and my reason are very, very different. What you think in your head and what I think in my head are different. And even, Kant was before him, but it's basically that everything is in your mind. Everything is in your mind. There's really no reality out there. All right. So what's in your mind and what's in my mind are totally different. So how can anybody say there's a truth? There's an objective truth that all of us need to live by, which the Catholic Church says, and it's about the only institution on the face of the earth that says it and says it without compromise, all right, and with good reasons. I was telling someone recently, I never went to Catholic schools in my whole life. I just went to a small town parish, and we had some nuns come, and this was in the 1960s when they were getting rid of their habits, and we had nuns that were in little like airline stewardess outfits, and But they had been very well educated. And I was a person that always wanted to know the reasons for things. And I always asked questions. And I have to say, these nuns answered my questions. And I thought, I've never heard anything like this. I asked, are there levels in heaven? What is it? But I thought everybody in heaven was happy. How can everybody be happy in heaven if there's levels? Won't I be jealous for the person that has more happiness than I have? I've probably heard this, the nuns all gave it to us. It's just like we're all different glasses of water, little shot glasses and big beer mugs, and they're all full. The shot glass can't take any more. So the shot glass can't say, I want as much as the mug, because you keep pouring it in, it just pours out. But you're as happy as you can be. And even better than that, there's little old me, a shot glass, looking at Mother Teresa, the beer mug, and saying, all right, she deserves more than me. I'd be unhappy if I had as much as she or she had as little as I, because it wouldn't be fair. So the nuns tell me this, and I'm sitting there, whoa! That is brilliant to my mind, all right? And the nuns did that for us. So the Catholic Church remains one of the sole places on the face of the earth that thinks there are objective truths, universal moral norms that we are obliged to follow.
Amen.
Amen. But because of Nietzsche and others, Nietzsche said, no, reason's not a source of truth. Reason is just, we hear it now these days, it's used to bully. Math is used to bully people, all right? It's white, privileged people that believe in math. And Nietzsche said, reason really is meant to be in service of my passions. And the best use of reason is to make sure I can get what I want, all right? It doesn't discover truth. It says, I want this, you want that, use your reason to get it, all right? That destroys Catholicism. Then there's those who think there is no spiritual world at all. Everything is matter. There's no such thing as immaterial things. And I always want to ask people, okay, those of you who believe that, tell me what color 2 is. What's it made out of? How heavy is it? How tall is it? How wide is it? Is 2 a material thing? Say no, 2 is not a material thing. It's an abstract concept, one that everybody in this room can be thinking of 2 at the same time. In fact, everybody in the whole world could be thinking of the number 2 at the same time. Is there any material thing, conceivably, that we could all be in contact with at the same time? There's not. 2 is an abstract concept, right? It's, if you want to say it's immaterial, has no matter. And then you think about things like friendship. What color is friendship? What does it smell like? What does it look like? What does it taste like? It's not a material thing. It's an immaterial thing. Then you move to the soul and other important immaterial things. But people say everything is matter. They say, you can't sustain that for more than a couple seconds. And again, then there's this turn to what's called subjectivity and relativism. There's no such thing as truth. Everything is relative. And I will tell this story several times this weekend, but it's one that formed me so much. I was a college student of 68 to 72, and we were all relativists at the time. We're absolute relativists, probably materialists, etc. There's no such thing as justice. I went to a very radical campus, Grinnell College in Iowa, and I wanted to be a radical. Yeah, that's interesting. We all wanted to look like John Lennon, and if you look at me long enough, you could see I probably managed pretty well, which I did. But I was taking this course from a professor who was not a relativist and not a subjectivist. And he was teaching Greek tragedy. And I hope you've had a chance to read Greek tragedy. If you haven't, I'd give it a shot. And we were reading a play called Medea, where Medea was married to Jason, and Jason had gone off to war and had been unfaithful to her. And she was mad as hell. So what she did, what women do when we're mad as hell, is we kill our children, we cut them up into little pieces, we put them in boiling water, and we feed them to our husbands. That's what Medea did. And so he was trying to get us to say how awful that was. No wonder the gods are mad. No wonder there's a sense of impending doom in this tragedy. Before long, things are going to fall apart. And we said, no, there's no such thing as justice. There's no such thing as objective truth. He said, you think it's okay that Medea did this? Well, I don't know, it was a different culture, different time. Who's to say? You know, he's almost beating his head against the wall. So then, there's a young man there, and he says, yeah, you can't know such as, you can't actually know anything. You can't know anything for certain. And he asks this young man, well, do you know anything for certain? Can you know anything for certain? No. Are you certain that you can't know anything for certain? He says, no, I'm not certain that I can't know anything for certain. Are you certain that you're not certain that you can't know anything for certain? And he said, we can go on an infinite regress, but really, do you really want to say that? And he'd say, well, let me ask you another question. He said, are there or are there not 40 pink elephants in this room? Okay, easy to answer, right? He says, I don't know. How could I know? All right, I could be dreaming, I could be hallucinating, I could be, in a fantasy world. How do I know what's in this room and what's not in this room? Now, at that point, I kind of had this epiphany, I'm saying, like, what? There's not even one non-pink elephant in this room, and I would die in defense of that truth. This guy didn't. He said, okay, let me ask you another question. He says, do you know whether or not you exist? And the young man says, no, I don't know whether or not I exist. And then he said, well, let me ask you this. Is it possible? So it means you possibly don't exist. He said, obviously. He said, well, is it possible for a non-existing thing to question its own existence? Some of you will recognize this as Descartes. If you doubt something, if I think, therefore I must exist. If I question my existence, I must exist, because a non-existing thing can't think about its existence. It's incredible. And the student would say, I don't know whether or not I exist. And so the professor, honestly, this went on for weeks. He'd cancel class. He'd say, okay, it's over. He said, I can't talk to someone who doesn't know whether or not he exists. He said, that's a position of insanity. And he said, I would be jeopardizing my own sanity if I did this. I kind of like that. And so that was a huge switch in my life, was realizing, again, that you can't say there's no such thing as truth, because you're saying it's true that there's no such thing as truth. It's a self-contradictory statement, all right? It just simply is. And philosophers write big, fat books trying to convince you that there's no such thing as truth. They're trying to convince you that it's true, that there's no such thing as truth, all right? Hundreds and hundreds of pages. It hurts when you think about it, all right? So modern philosophy has done this to us, and it has creeped into the church in all sorts of ways, all right? Where religion becomes a private matter, all right? These are my private beliefs that I choose to believe, and it has nothing to do with objective truth, right? So there's been various ways, infiltration of many ideas into the church. One is Masonry. There's this book by Taylor Marshall called Infiltration. I have some real problems with the book. I think I hate to say it, Taylor, I like Taylor, I'm sorry, Taylor, but there's some sloppiness in the scholarship, all right? And there's some sloppiness in the argumentation. I'm absolutely certain, I'll tell you later, that the Vatican, in fact, has been infiltrated by Masons, but I'm not certain he does justice to the topic. The church has been against Freemasonry basically from the start of Freemasonry, which was established in a sense to topple the Catholic Church, all right, in Europe. And the church was originally made up of stonemasons, that's why it became Mason. Then it became a quasi-religious organization very much against the Catholic Church. And it is, it's more or less satanic at the highest levels. Now, groups like the Shriners are basically Masons, but they're at there's many degrees. I think 33 degree is the highest degree. And a lot of the men on the lower level have no idea what is up on the higher level, all right? There can be a real innocence to people who are in the Masons, but at one time, Catholics were, I don't know if we were excommunicated, but we were certainly told not to have anything to do with the Masons. And when a Mason reaches the 30th degree in the Masonic hierarchy called the Kadosh, the person crushes with his foot the papal tiara and the royal crown and swears to free mankind from the bondage of despotism and the thraldom of spiritual tyranny. So they're actually in war, and they're all over the United States. In fact, there's a good reason to think that some of the founding fathers of this nation were Masons. Very disturbing. All right. Here it is. Yeah, from 1738 to 1983, Catholics were forbidden to join the Masons under pain of excommunication. It's now no longer under pain of excommunication, but is a mortal sin. Anybody heard that anywhere from the pulpit or anywhere? No. All right, it should be told. And now, there's also been, they believe, an infiltration of communists. Communists and the Masons should be opposed to each other, but they work hand in hand against the church. A very famous story is that of Bella Dodd, who was an Italian-American woman who became a communist. She was a part of the teachers' union in New York City, and she claims that she herself put in the seminaries around 1,100 young men who were communists. 1,100. Over about a 20-year period at the longest. There's all sorts of, she was a communist. There's no question about that. She converted to Catholicism. She actually, I think, was a baptized Catholic. She had an Italian grandmother who baptized her. Under Fulton Sheen, she came back to Catholicism. And he asked her, it's hard for me to believe, not to say anything about it, because the church did this, still does it. It would be a scandal for people to know that 1,000 men had been put into the priesthood who were communists. And she claimed that there were still 4 highly placed cardinals in the church who were among that group of the 1,000 that she had helped put in. I have some trouble believing it. There's parts of it have to be true, but she's got to be the best vocation recruiter that's ever existed in the history of the church. And these are young men going into a seminary that have to put up with stuff that they absolutely hate. And so far as I know, there's no one that's come forward to say I was one of those 1,000. I find that hard to believe, okay? But there's evidence of all sorts of kinds. One is this book, AA 1025, which Memoirs of the Communist Infiltration into the Church. And this was a book that was found in a suitcase by a nurse of a guy who was dying, and it's his story of going into the seminary and how he was placed there by communists and how he was trying to twist Catholic teaching more in the direction of communism. And I don't know if you're aware, but the Holy Father recently said we have to open our minds to the possibility that communism is not incompatible with Catholicism. Right? And the Church has had anything it's said about communism before this has been a condemnation of it. Absolutely incompatible with Catholicism. I'm sorry it's so hard to read, but there's a Vatican official as chaplain of 3 Masonic lodges, and he publishes a book on reconciling Masonry, Catholicism, and Freemasonry. A Catholic priest, all right, who's the chaplain for 3 Masonic, they call them lodges, the groups. It's incomprehensible, all right, that this should be the case. One of the documents against modernism was by Pius X, Pascendi Dominici Gregis, on the error of the modernists. And he called it the syllabus of all heresies. The modernism was the crystallization of all of them. And he says he gave priests, pastors, confessors, etc., an oath to take, the oath against modernism. It was required of all clergy, pastors, confessors, preachers, religious superiors, and professors in seminaries from 1910 to 1967. And then they stopped. And you want to say, what was it about Masonry and modernism that changed that would make this oath no longer necessary? All right, modernism is an adaptation of the church to the modern world. The syllabus of errors listed 65 widespread modern errors. It's called the synthesis of all errors, a radical denial of the faith agnosticism, you don't believe in God, you don't know whether God exists, radical evolutionism, in all realms, including theology. Things change, just like evolution in the physical world. Ideas change. We have to be open to that. Subjectivism, meaning everything is in my own preferences are the truth that I need to live by. All right, I don't need to live by a truth that's out there. I need to be true to my own values, even if they are wretched values, even if they are anti-Catholic values. I need to be true to my own self, all right? Relativism, meaning, Medea cuts up her kids and boils them. That was their time. Who knows what their values were? Maybe it's okay. I'm told that young people have a very hard time. Most of them don't know about Hitler, don't know about Nazism. And when they hear about it, they say, who am I to judge? Right? That's a different time and a different place. True. And of course, communism. Now, this is what I lived through in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. The dissenters. The church was basically, people think all of this is new, and it was prepared. I thought it was kind of over with John Paul II and Benedict, that the church had righted itself. We got some excellent popes who were brilliant, absolutely among the most brilliant men that had ever lived, and they were the head of the Catholic Church, and their ability to do philosophy and theology and science, anything you wanted, was incredible. But through the 60s and 70s, the dissenters got control of the church, especially of the universities. Right? The theologians were not faithful men, and those who were and women, and those who were faithful could not get jobs in the university. And then when John Paul II, Benedict came along, things were changing. They were changing that more and more faithful theologians, philosophers were getting hired at universities. One is Charles Curran. Some of you know who he was. He was the one that stood on the steps of Catholic University of America in 1968 and said that Catholics did not have to accept Humanae Vitae. It was based on an inadequate, erroneous understanding of natural law. All right. I had an exchange on my Facebook page with a young man recently who told me that Bishop Schneider, some of you might know Bishop Schneider, extraordinary bishop, it seems a holy man, unbelievably learned man, erudite man. They don't make them like that anymore. And he said to me, Charles Curran and Schneider are both dissenters. They're just the same. And I go, Schneider has raised some questions about Vatican II, and I'll explain those in a minute. But he loves the faith from his head to his toes, or he would die for the faith. And Charles Curran was approved of contraception, homosexuality, masturbation, divorce, women priests, you name it. How can you compare these two? All right, that's Hans Küng. All right, he questioned the teaching on infallibility. This is Cardinal Paglia, who is I think he's now in charge. Sometimes I get him confused with another. I'm a little tired, but either he or someone as bad as him is in charge of the JP2 Institute now, and just simply rejecting church teaching. And then a lot of you will already know Father James Martin, who seems to be able to do anything he wants to do and is not disciplined. He's the one that, right after the document came out that said that couples in same-sex relationships could receive a blessing, he called up two of his friends who were male, married to each other, and invited them down to his rectory and gave them a blessing, and just happened to have a reporter there from the New York Times who took a picture and put it on the front cover of the New York Times the next day. This is, even though the document says it has to be done in private, all right? And you cannot be inviting people. It's when they come up and ask you. He will not be disciplined for this. There's just no way. He's been doing that sort of thing for some time. That's been going on definitely since the 60s, all right? That dissenters have had a foothold in the university that's been pretty unbelievable. Financial corruption. It's kind of a scary picture. I'm not good with finance and numbers and all that, but I read this book. If you really want to know about some serious financial corruption in the church, read God's Bankers, A History of Money and Power at the Vatican. And Gerald Posner is considered to be a very good historian. His book has gotten good reviews. And he claims that the Vatican Bank was set up when the church was as poor as it could be, about 1920s or so, 30s, had no money, had lost all of its papal lands because of politics, etc. And some genius came to the Vatican and said, set up a bank, and set up a bank that's unregulated. You're an independent nation. You don't have to follow the regulation of the European nations. So you can do whatever you want with the money that comes here. And they do whatever they want, and they don't keep any records. After 10 years, all the records are destroyed in the Vatican. And so it's just a lovely thing. You get to make a donation to the Vatican. Charitable donation, millions of dollars, you write it off. Where does the Vatican send that money? We don't want to know, honestly. And the problem is we don't know, and there's no way of knowing. And some of the men that have been involved in this, I mean, they get hung up on the London Bridge, all right, because they were involved in this and about to squeal, or there were some mafia type things going on. It's absolutely horrifying. Another one is this one called Operation Gladio, the unholy alliance between the Vatican, the CIA, and the mafia. Want to get your head blown? This will do it. All right. Just a short portion of this, but the Vatican hated communism and also hated fascism, but it thought that fascism could be manipulated to fight communism. Right? So they did a lot of financial support of fascists in order to fight communism. And after World War II, they wanted to make sure that there were sort of cells all over Italy of communist resistors, which were mostly fascist, but they needed to fund these places, right? And so they set up a money laundering scheme with the CIA. Right? The CIA was also unanswerable to nobody. All right, the CIA can do it. The Congress can't investigate it. Even the president is often not told what the CIA did. And they actually started engaging in drug selling, trafficking. And they would actually sell it to inner city African-American population who are poor, and said, we'll get them hooked on drugs and we'll make a lot of money. And they're kind of not contributing to society anyway. So this is how we'll support Operation Gladio in Italy, by selling drugs in the U.S. Read it. It's just, I hope it's not true, of course, but so far as I can tell, it has not been refuted, right? So, sorry guys. There's a new one. Some of you have heard of this wonderful, the name is wonderful, Cardinal Pizzabella, all right? Beautiful pizza. He's been accused of a multi-million-dollar fraud in the country of Jordan, helping set up a university there that was set up under like 3 or 4 names, and the money is being switched around and round and round, and here it goes, there it goes. It's incredible. It hasn't stopped. Political corruption, you've been following this, some of you I sure have. What the GOP lawmakers once praised Catholic Charities, now they want to defund the group. How much there is going on of how much Catholic Charities is very much involved in the illegal immigration. They're maybe the major agency that brings people into the United States, provides them clothing, housing, everything that they need. Getting an enormous amount of money from the government to do this. There's something, I keep hearing this number must be much larger, but there's like 85,000 children who are unaccounted for, who have come across the border. And most likely they are being sexually trafficked, all right? And the Catholic Church is not doing anything to stop that or prevent that from happening. In fact, the funds are being used for that. The Vatican-China deal, many consider to be a betrayal to millions of Christians in China. Chinese government has given permission by the Vatican to appoint their own bishops they're basically now free of governance by the Catholic Church. And the Catholic Church in China persecutes priests who are not part of the National Catholic Church of China, that don't line up behind the bishops appointed by China, but said, no, these are imposters. They're just here to ruin the church, not to promote the church, because they've been appointed by the government to do what the government wants to do rather than what Jesus Christ wants them to do. It's a very, very bad story. And some of you have seen the stories of, Cardinal Zen, who keeps trying to go to the Vatican and talk to Pope Francis about this and can't get a meeting with him. He's a 90-year-old man who undoubtedly is going to be declared a saint someday. I've talked a little bit about liturgical corruption, and I probably should move a little more quickly, but one of the books that's incredible to read about this is by an Annibale Bugnini. Most of you know, I hope you do know, if you don't, do a little study into this, that the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, is not at all what Vatican II was asking for, right? It's a totally different thing. As a matter of fact, it absolutely rejects some of the things that are said in Vatican II. Vatican II said there should always be Latin in the Mass. It said that the chant should absolutely be reserved. It said nothing about turning around the altar. It said nothing about getting rid of the communion rail. It's unbelievable. But what happened is this Annibale Bugnini and others got appointed to a special commission that was asked to write a new liturgy. I didn't know they were told to write a new liturgy. They were asked to write a liturgy that corresponded to Vatican II. And it turns out that Annibale Bugnini was a Mason, all right? And he didn't want anything in the new Mass that would be offensive to Protestants, all right? So he took out the whole notion of the Mass as being a sacrifice. Instead, it was a meal. It was a source of blessings. It wasn't a reenactment of Calvary, right? And so it was radically changed. The cardinals and bishops at Vatican II that voted to approve Sacrosanctum Concilium had nothing like the Novus Ordo in mind, nothing. They thought it would basically be that, and I remember in 1965 when there were always missals that had Latin on one side and English on the other. So we, just like now, we had availability, we had the vernacular available. So what they did is they flipped it. English was on one side and Latin was on the other. And the whole Mass was said in Latin, but it was identical to the Latin Mass. It was the same Mass. It was just put into English. That made a lot of sense, all right? I'm one of those that would I love the Mass in Latin. I'm ready to have the whole Mass in Latin. Again, I have my degree in classical languages. I think it's important to have a sacred language. But I'd be very happy with a Mass that had the Gloria, the Credo, the Agnus Dei, all of this in Latin. We can all learn those, right? And that would unite the church around the world. I mean, when people say that in Traditionis Custodes, of all things, it says the Novus Ordo is unifying. I said, how can it be unifying when it's in a different language in every country, right? When it's in Latin, it's in the same language in every country. So at least we have the same language, and I understand wanting the vernacular in some parts of the Mass. I don't have any objection to that. But most people have no idea. I was one. Until very recently, I had no idea of the roots of the Novus Ordo. And when I read it, I was shocked. All right, you might be interested in this little book. This got my goat. Three very good scholars, people I know personally and like them, wrote this, just what they thought to be a devastating critique of the traditional Latin Mass, 5-part series that appeared in a Notre Dame journal online. Got my goat. So I sat down and I wrote a 5-part series response to them, as did people who are much more qualified than I am to do the same. I'm not a liturgist, and neither are any of these three who wrote it. So if they can do it, I can do it. But I sent mine to some top liturgists and to make certain that I had it, what I was saying, accurate. But it's a really fascinating thing how many things people think about what was the source of the Novus Ordo and what really was the source, and have no idea. Okay, I'm getting there. Vatican II. What Went Wrong with Vatican II, written by one of my great mentors, Ralph McIntyre. And what he really says, what went wrong with Vatican II was Humanae Vitae, and not Humanae Vitae, but dissent from Humanae Vitae. Vatican II gave people the impression that everything was up for grabs, all right, and the church would soon change its teachings, all right. I have to say, I believe it's a legitimate council. It's a pastoral council. It proposed no new doctrines. It's ambiguous in some key portions. And the spirit of Vatican II was a very serious problem. People, they can't find what they want in the text, like with the Mass, where it says no more Latin. It says the opposite. Latin must always be preserved. So when they say certain things, they show me in the text, and they can't. This is Bishop Schneider. He's extraordinary. He wrote about the springtime that never came, which does raise some real questions about Vatican II. One is that the ecumenism, which generally holds the equality of all religions, and that we're not supposed to convert the Jews. They're as favored people, favored by God. Catholicism says, get it, we want them all. The Catholic Church is the truth, so we want everybody to have a fullness of the truth. Vatican II suggests that the Muslims worship the same God. Our God is a trinity, theirs is not. How can it be the same God? All right, universalism, that all are saved, right? Religious liberty. Again, everybody should be allowed to practice their faith. And now, of course, we have something like Wicca approved in the U.S. military, etc. It's just one more religion. You can't sort of make distinctions anymore between legitimate and wacko religions. And we put the primacy of conscience over objective truth, and that Vatican II was meant to condemn communism, that communism had been steadily, regularly condemned by the church, but they didn't do it because they wanted Russia to send Russian Orthodox priests to Rome. So they didn't want to offend Russia, and they made no condemnation of communism, which now makes people think that, well, maybe communism is okay. And a complete openness to the world. All right, let's see. I can't go a little bit more. Okay. These are three great books by Roberto de Mattei. One is on the Second Vatican Council that tells us that there had been a whole number of schema, they call them, which were preparatory documents on different subjects, the Mass, the liturgy, the Bible, and they had been distributed to all the bishops of the world, and all the bishops of the world had approved them. And Pope John the 23rd, who was in charge of the council, said, these are great. The council should take just like a couple months for us to get there. And then shows up at the council a whole bunch of mostly German theologians who somehow convinced the council to scrap all those documents and start all over again. All right. It's a shocking story, and a lot of it was just sort of, skullduggery. People who knew how to manage the bureaucratic system would shout speakers down that they didn't want to speak, and wouldn't send information to groups that they didn't want to have it, and all that sorts of stuff. And then there's a wonderful book by him, Love for the Papacy and Filial Resistance to the Pope, in the history of the Church. Different times where the popes were resisted by the faithful, all right, and the faithful were right. Some of us know the story of St. Athanasius, Contra Mundum, a very famous story where he was the one that insisted on the divinity of Jesus, the identity of Jesus with God the Father. He was excommunicated 5 times, even though his position was ratified by a major council, all right, because there were popes and others who didn't like that position, all right. One bishop, St. Athanasius, Contra Mundum, against the world, and he upheld a truth that was later verified. And Pius V is one of my favorite saints and popes. This was at the time of Trent, and all the wonderful things he did to preserve the faith. There's a man named Michael Davies that I kept at arm's length my whole time in the 60s and 70s, and he tried to show that the Vatican Council was being used to sabotage the tradition of the Church. This is an interview of him with a priest done by, I should have the whole picture there, with William Buckley. It's a marvelous debate. He wrote many books. The Catholic Sanctuary and the Second Vatican Council, Liturgical Time Bombs, in Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council, and religious liberty. All right, sexual corruption. All right, this is the heart of things. All right. When Vatican II came out, as I said, that people thought everything could change. And they thought, for instance, soon there was going to be married priests. Right? So between 1970 and 1990, 20,000 men left the priesthood in the United States. 20,000. Most of these were heterosexuals because they thought they could get married and eventually would be welcomed back into the church. Who did that leave behind in the seminaries? All right. Now, the church, I'm certain, has always had a disproportionate number of homosexual men because they go in to hide. For centuries, it was a great shame to be homosexual. You didn't want grandma to know why you weren't married, or mom to know why you weren't married. You go in the priesthood, okay? I suspect many of those men led chaste lives because chastity was valued at the time. Now it's no longer. You think you can't be happy unless you have an active sex life. And the priests came to believe that. Contraception pushed that notion. You can't have a happy marriage unless you have sex available at all times. And if heterosexuals can't be happy without sex all the time, and that their sex doesn't have to be procreative, what's wrong with the sex of homosexuals whose sex is not procreative? The logic is very powerfully there. All right, so between 60s and 70s, 80s, well into the 90s and maybe longer, seminaries became a breeding ground for homosexual priests and eventually homosexual bishops. Right? They were mostly the people that were still left in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then heterosexual men would not join the priesthood. They did not want to go into a seminary that was largely homosexual. They were given a very hard time, and they were kicked out of the seminary, right? Because they were too pious, they were too rigid. Also, they wouldn't go along with the program. I mean, I've talked to seminarians and priests who went through the seminary at that time, and again, the message is still pretty much the same, which is keep your head down, keep your mouth shut, stay in your lane, don't cause any trouble, don't rock the boat. All right, and so we're not building men in the seminary who have backbones, who can stand up and say, that's wrong, he's this, I've got to report this. Instead, they get canceled if they do that. All right, they've rocked the boat. So the ones that get promoted to bishop, not all the time. I know some very good bishops with some very strong backbones. What we have to say in the United States, only one has publicly made that very clear, which is Bishop Strickland, and what happened to him, right? But there's many. I mean, there's not that there aren't, I don't know if there's many, but there are others. But they have decided, maybe they're right, maybe God has said to them, I don't want you to rock the boat. We have to have some good bishops. Stay where you are, all right? Maybe it's God saying that to them, all right? I don't know. But I have to say that we don't see bishops standing up and saying, I mean, it's been sort of lovely with this statement on blessing priests. I mean, blessing homosexual, blessing couples and homosexual relationships. How many bishops around the world in bishop conferences, especially in Africa, have said, we're not going to do it. We're just not going to do it. I don't know that we've ever seen anything like this, all right, this wholesale, it's not defiance, because honestly, these are bishops who by all their inclination are of the most faithful brand. It's like pro-lifers. There's no more law-abiding citizens than pro-lifers, you know? And then they break the law to save a human life. And people say, you're lawless people. I would say, do you realize these people don't jaywalk, all right? They'll pay for, they'll put money in a meter even when there's no chance of them getting caught at all. They stop at red stop signs in the middle of the night when there's no cars anywhere. I mean, that's who these people are, all right? They are not lawless people. And the bishops who are going against the statement coming out of the Vatican are not rebellious bishops. Every fiber of their being wants to be completely in union with Rome because they understand it to be the true church. So now this phrase is used, the lavender mafia, that the church is infiltrated not just with Masons, not just with communists, not just with modernists, but with active homosexual men, all right? One man who says that was Richard Sipe. He was a Benedictine monk for some time, and he discovered that the monks were being preyed upon, younger monks being preyed upon by the older monks, and he was just appalled by that. He left and became a top-notch psychologist. He wasn't necessarily opposed to homosexuals in the priesthood. He just didn't want predation, and he did an enormous amount of work. Back in the early 2000s, he said that at least, and he named them by name, at least 30% of bishops in the United States were active homosexuals. And I think that has increased and increased and increased over the years. There's a book in the early 2000s by Donald Cousins, who is he's a priest. He was a rector of a seminary in Ohio, and I think he was the vicar for clergy in the diocese of, I don't know, Cleveland, one of the Cleveland, Cincinnati, one of the C's. Okay, and he says in his book, he says the changing face of the priesthood. He said we have to admit it. The priesthood has become a homosexual vocation, and again, he wasn't opposed to that. He just said, but they require a different kind of training, a different kind of care, a different kind of instruction than heterosexuals, and we need to start doing that. All right. So these are both two men who didn't oppose homosexual priests. They just thought we weren't dealing well with them. And again, we have the appointment of bishops. They appoint each other. And this is a fascinating story. I'll try to go quite quickly, but this is really fascinating. You might have heard him on the internet, Father Charles Murr. He's written many books. These three are he's written, all his books are just a great read. They're a great read. He's a priest. He was a priest in Rome in the 1970s, and his mentor was an incredible priest who was high up in the Secretary of State. And he told him of four high priests, cardinals, who archbishops, went to Paul VI and said to Paul VI, the Vatican is infiltrated with Masons. You need to do something about it. And Paul VI was a little hesitant, and they said, the person you want to get to do this is Bishop Gagnon from Canada. He's a man of the utmost integrity. So Gagnon undertook an investigation and he told everybody, I'm doing an investigation. So all the secretaries come and would come and tell him everything. He says, absolutely taken over by the Masons. He wrote 3 different volumes of 3 different kinds of approaches to the question after about 3 years study. And this Charles Murr worked side by side with him. Gagnon was incredibly discreet, but Murr connected to the dots of what was going on. And he took these 3 volumes to Paul VI, and this was like I think he started his study in 73 and took it to him in 76 or so, in 77. And Paul VI was very sick. And he said, I can't do anything about it. I'm just too sick. I'll have to leave this to my successor. And Gagnon said, you must do something about Cardinal Sebastian Baggio. Cardinal Sebastian Baggio. He is, he's a Mason. And he is in charge, he's the top one on the upper left, upper right. He's a Mason. And he is in charge of the Congregation for Appointing Bishops all around the world. He said, you have to fire him. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'll leave it to my successor. When he died, Gagnon took his 3 volumes to John Paul I and said, you have to fire Sebastian Baggio. He's appointing bad bishops all over the world. And he said, okay, I'll do that. And he told his Secretary of State to fire Baggio from the Congregation of Bishops and send him to Venice, which is a very nice place, actually. But he wouldn't go. He wanted to be appointing bishops. So he went over to visit with Paul VI and had a shouting match with him that's very well documented. And he died that night, John Paul I. And there's very good evidence that he was poisoned. Right? It's worth looking into. Right? So when John Paul II was chosen, poor little Gagnon took his volumes over to John Paul II and said, you got to do something about it. The Curia is filled with Masons, and the biggest problem is Sebastian Baggio. And he said, maybe I'll get to it later. He said, I don't want to start my pontificate by making heads roll. I'm going to be a teaching, traveling pontiff. I don't want to start that way. So I'll get to it later. And again, just said, you might not live long enough. So after the assassination attempt on John Paul II, as he's coming out of his groggy state from surgery, evidently one of the first things he said was, get me Gagnon. All right. Now Gagnon had become completely demoralized, and he went off to Colombia where he'd been a missionary and was happily serving there as a missionary. But came back to Rome. John Paul II made him a cardinal, and he made Baggio the head of the stamp office in Rome. Okay. That's a really nice demotion. Bonini, the author of Novus Ordo, once Paul VI came to realize he was a Mason, sent him off to Iran to be a cardinal there. Very few Catholics there, not a distinguished position, all right? So want to think about who's been appointing bishops. Seminaries are filled with homosexuals. We have a Mason appointing bishops from 73 to 84. Those bishops appoint bishops, and we have what we have, all right? Modern popes, I worshipped Paul VI for a long time because of Humanae Vitae, but when I hear what he did with the Novus Ordo and other things, I just don't have that same passion, all right? John Paul II, I'll always love, all right? But he did some questionable things when he had a inter-religious dialogue at Assisi. It was very confusing to people, but I still think nobody's perfect, even saints aren't perfect, and there's no harder job on the face of the earth than to be the Pope, all right? Benedict, I never thought I could love a Pope more than I loved John Paul II. And then when Ratzinger comes there, Pope Benedict, I felt like an unfaithful wife, all right? I felt like an unfaithful wife. I love him. I just absolutely love him. How come I love him? But he had a spotty record. He was a peritus, one of the experts that was at Vatican II, and he moved things, it seems, in a modernist direction. He later repented of that, all right? And he said, you can't say too much when you're a pope, but you can give signals that, I'm not that way anymore. I've moved away from that. I listened by audible book to a 24-hour biography of Benedict. He was an extraordinary man, all right? He was a scholar from head to toe. That's all he wanted, a priest scholar. And then he's become a bishop, and he was an excellent bishop. He was an excellent, excellent bishop. And then they made him head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. And he didn't want to do that. He wanted to write his books. People say, oh no, he wanted to make heads roll. He did not want to make heads roll, but he did what he had to do. He did some really tough stuff. He didn't want to be Pope for anything, and then he's Pope. And really, he thought he had. Some people think it's the worst thing that's ever happened. The worst thing everybody did was retire. You saw the pictures. I think he was near death. He was just completely worn out, and just, whatever he said, told those men of the Curia to do, they wouldn't do. And what do? Bring in the Swiss Guard, right? What do? All right, and now we have Pope Francis. And one of his biggest critics is this Henry Cyr, wrote a book called The Dictator Pope, and he's got some more incredible stories of Pope Francis worth reading. There are these books that say that there was a plot to get Pope Francis into the church. It's been admitted by Daniels, I think. He said, yeah, we got together in Switzerland at a place called St. Gallen, and we plotted how, he said it himself, we plotted how to get Bergoglio made the Pope. This is a book by one of my colleagues at the seminary at Chevrolet. It's a remarkable book. He's a very good theologian. He wrote this book defending everything that Pope Francis was doing. A couple years later, he said, I was wrong, and wrote a retraction, basically, of his first book. So what do we do now? Well, there are reasons for hope. There's lots of reasons for hope. I think homeschooling, classical education, charter schools are phenomenal, and they're growing like crazy in the United States. There's amazing Catholic colleges that young people can go to now. This is the future. There's a regeneration of parishes. The parish I go to has so many offerings of wonderful ways to grow in your faith. The Bible in a year, of course, the Catechism in a year. These things are, the most popular podcast ever is the Bible in a year read by a Catholic priest. Come on. And if you go on that website, and I know some people don't like Chosen, that series, but if you go on the website, millions have converted to Catholicism because of these productions. It's under the wavelength of most people. They have no idea the number of conversions there are, the number of conversions of Muslims to Christianity. Those who actually have personal visitations by Jesus or Mary. You start looking those up online and you think, it's unbelievable. The action of the Holy Spirit in our time is really unbelievable. And you can't keep your eyes just on the corruption. You have to start looking around, and you will see that the faith is, virtually every one of my colleagues, after the McCarrick scandal hit, now you might not know this, be unlikely that most academics are pretty darn full of ourselves. We're kind of egotistical, you might say. And those of us who are Catholics, teach in seminaries, we're pretty darn good Catholics when you think about it. And, we have decent prayer lives because, you can just toddle off to the chapel anytime, and you can toddle off to daily mass, and you read theology all the time. What more can you do? Well, when the McCarrick thing hit, I think all of us thought we were somewhere around 85 to 97% doing what Catholics should do. And we all of a sudden realized we were about 65%. And all of us doubled down, realized we really needed to double down on our faith life. And I've seen so many people, I'm so mad at the church. I'm so mad at these priests. I'm so mad at that. I've got to become a stronger Catholic. That seems to me the right response, right? Not that I have to leave. It's that I love this church and I'm going to use all the resources it has to advance my holiness and become an evangelist to help others become Catholics or stronger Catholics. We have unbelievable online resources. If you have any question, you can find so many great answers online. There's better liturgies. There's the traditional Latin Mass is more available. Again, it wasn't available for decades. It makes me cry. But as I said, the Novus Ordo Masses are virtually all of them, I think, becoming better. And people are praying more. More and more places have adoration. I don't know, again, where is this covered? But 20,000 Catholic students spent several days together in St. Louis, right? And it's not all the kind of music that I'm not so crazy about. Some of it was very traditional, very beautiful music. I never bought this thing that young people like all that stuff because I've never liked it, and I was young once, right? So I never believed it. People, they say young people, here's a young person sitting on the floor. Some people like to sit on the floor. I hate sitting on the floor. I've never liked sitting on the floor. And when I was at college, she said, let's all sit on the floor. So do we have to? What are chairs? This was a good idea, so far as I could tell. There's wisdom in this. All right. And of course we have all the saints, right? We'll never lose that. And they're with us. They're with us every step of the way. So find your saints. Find your saints, read their biographies, learn what they did. I'm just reading a book now. I forget the title, but it's something like the Irish love of the Mass. And it's about the time, it's like 2 centuries, where Catholicism was totally persecuted by Protestants in Ireland. And the Irish would get killed and fined for going to a Catholic Mass. And they still did it up in the mountains and anywhere they could. And they were killed. And they would make a little grass hut for the priest to say the Mass so the wind wouldn't knock everything all over. And then you'd have hundreds in the fields on their knees in the rain, all right, just to be present at a Catholic Mass. They couldn't even receive communion. They didn't have enough hosts to hand out, right? But they just wanted to be there for centuries. And I'm reading that. And I do have a little bit of pride that when COVID happened, our churches were all closed, and a local church would put the monstrance in a window at the school and put a couple chairs outside. And there was a day or two when I was out there and it was cold. I felt proud, but that I would allow myself to be killed, to be outside of a little hut, and not even I don't know. But hundreds, thousands. There was, if a young man decided to become a Catholic priest and went off to Rome to study, I learned this when I was there and went to the Irish seminary in Rome. It was an average of a year and a half after they went back to Ireland that they would be martyred. A year and a half. So they would leave Ireland, go to Rome, study 4 or 6 years to be a priest, go back to Ireland and be killed within a year and a half. Whoa, is that inspiring or what? When I'm sort of sitting around saying, oh, I'm tired today. I don't know if I'm going to make it to daily mass, And then I think of these Irish priests and I think, all right. So adoration. If you're not doing adoration, I suspect everybody is these days, but if you're not, get with the program. All right. Even if it's just 10 minutes, do it. Find it and go do it, and you will be amazed. You will just be amazed. And start with 10, move to 15, move to 20. You'll be just like the rest of us, my guess is, at least my prayer for many, many years, always starts out scolding God, This person needs help. Where have you been? All right? You could do something about this. I can't, but you can, but you're not doing anything. What about this? All right? So about 20 minutes, I'm doing this. All right? And then you hear this little voice says, done yet? Yeah, I'm done. Okay, I'm done. Okay, well, maybe you want to listen to me for a minute? I said, well, yeah, I guess that's a good idea. And, after you live long enough, I don't know if I've lived long enough, but I will say this. In my living, I have found one truth is that God's will is always better than my will. And if there's a fight between me and God about something, I want God to win. All right? And so quickly you start saying those prayers. Instead of saying, why aren't you doing this? You say, what is it you want me to do? All right? And it's the only way to be. And you will get messages. You will get messages. Say, call this person. You say, I haven't called that person forever. I want you to call this person. I want to call that person. All right? So that kind of thing all the time. And of course, at the end of it all is the Holy Spirit. We cannot change the problems in the church. We absolutely cannot. And that's part of the reason it's not all that important. You follow it too much. It's not up to you. The bishops are the problem. And the only people that can deal with the bishops being a problem are the bishops. But the bishops are the problem. So we're stuck. We're just plain old stuck on a natural level. On a natural level. Pray for the good priests. Support the good priests. Tell the good priests how much you love them and you support them. And you're so glad they've stuck with it because they're demoralized in the extreme. All right, they love their priesthood, but they're not being allowed to preach the gospel, right? And they're just feeling like their hands are tied. And they're afraid that if they do something brave, like say that homosexuality is wrong, they'll be canceled, all right? So they live in fear. They live in fear. And some people say, well, they should just jump up and shout and say these things are wrong. And I say, maybe some are. They have to pray. They have to listen to God. God's going to say, yeah, I want you to be a martyr. Stick your head up and be sidelined for the next 20 years of your life, even though this is what you devote your life to. And others, he's going to say, do keep your head down. Now, this isn't the head of the seminary saying that this is God, right? Keep your head down. Attend to your flock, right? We need you. I don't know which one. I don't know what God's saying to you. All right, as usual, on and on and on. But I'm done. Thanks.